As we've already studied, fiscal policy is fairly straightforward at its most basic idea. Now we're going to get into how it's not nice and neat like we thought it was before. So for example, if the government decides to buy 1,000 planes from Boeing for $50 billion, what then happens to that money? In fiscal policy, what we've done so far is we've said, well, aggregate demand would increase by 50 billion because that's how much government is added to the GDP, but there's a process called the multiplier process, where that $50 billion Boeing receives, and then they pay their workers with it, they buy more capital with it, and their workers buy stuff with their income, and then the money keeps kind of flowing down the way. And so while the initial increase of $50 billion is correct, there's more than just the $50 billion added to GDP because of the multiplier effect of it's not like Boeing lights that money on fire, they're going to do something with it. There are two macroeconomic effects from the change in government purchases. The multiplier effect, which we're going to talk about now, the crowding out effect, we're going to deal with later. The multiplier effect is when government purchases are made, it has a multiplying effect on aggregate demand of more than the increase in spending or the decrease in taxes. So the multiplier effect refers to the additional increase in aggregate demand from an increase in government spending. Here's an illustration of the multiplier effect. So imagine we're at AD1, government increases expenditure by the 50 billion stated earlier. So here's AD2, which is the difference of which is the 50 billion they gave to Boeing. However, once Boeing spends that money and adds to GDP, and once those workers who got paid by Boeing buy stuff with that extra money that didn't exist before in the economy, it increases aggregate demand again and again with each additional purchase. And so that's how we end up seeing the multiplier effect play out. The first part of the multiplier effect deals with the idea that if I give you $100, what two options do you have? Pause and think about it for a minute. And you only have two options. That's right. The two options you have are you can consume with it, buy stuff now, or you can save some of that money and buy stuff later. Those two concepts are called the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. MPC is the fraction of extra income that a household consumes with rather than saves. So if I give you $100 and you decide I'm going to buy a new pair of shoes for $50, I'm going to save $50 for college next year, then that's the ratio of those two, the MPC and the MPS. The MPS then is the fraction that you would save rather than consume with. Now to find the spending multiplier, you would use the equation of 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or because 1 equals MPS plus MPC, because when I give you $1, you can only do two things with it, consume with it or save it. That the multiplier can also be expressed as 1 over MPS. Once we find the multiplier, what can we do with it? Well, it can be used to show or to fill a recessionary gap. So for example, if the MPC is equal to 3/4 or 0.75, and potential GDP is 100, so that'd be like LRAS, and current real GDP, the short run output, is only $80. How do we fix that? Well, we use the multiplier. So this is the equation you would use to find this out. What we need to do is increase real GDP by $20 in this case. So it's equal to, well, how much do we have to increase spending by? What's government going to increase spending by? Times the multiplier, which we're going to use this number MPC to figure out. And so how much does increase in spending shift AD by? So when you find the multiplier, it's 1 over 1 minus 3/4, or 1 over 1/4, which would be 4. And use the multiplier to find the increase in AD. Well, that $5 billion times 4, the multiplier, would close that recessionary gap of the $20 from the last page. And that's what this equation is. So a $5 increase in spending leads to a $20 billion, or in this case $20, increase in GDP. A couple notes. A larger MPC means that a larger multiplier in the economy, so the larger the MPC is, the closer it is to 1, the larger the multiplier is going to be. So if MPC is 0.5, then the multiplier is going to be 2. If the MPC is 0.9, then the multiplier is going to be 10. And another thing, a smaller MPC may indicate a recession. And if you think about it, during a recession, what do people do less of? They spend less. In this case, I want to use the word consume so we don't think MPS is spending, it's saving. So we consume with less during a recession because we're going to save more of it. So you may be thinking to yourself, Mr. Null, I got this. When the government spends $1, it increases real GDP by more than $1 because of the multiplier. And my response is, yeah, but only kind of. And you're probably, now what? Well, that's where the crowding out effect comes into play. We're not going to deal with that now. We're going to focus just on the multiplier. There are two other multipliers, the first of which is the tax multiplier. And the idea behind it is that government spending increases aggregate demand directly. Taxes don't. Taxes, increase or decrease of taxes doesn't directly impact aggregate demand. So which multiplier do you think would be larger? If you think that, well, what's the effect going to be on AD, government spending is going to be larger. And that's true. So the spending multiplier is larger. The tax multiplier equation is this, negative MPC over MPS. The negative sign here denotes that taxes have an inverse relationship with the change in real GDP. So for example, when Congress cuts taxes, it's going to increase aggregate demand or increase real GDP. When they increase taxes, it's going to decrease aggregate demand and real GDP. So take a second and pause the video and calculate these different tax multipliers if the MPC is 0.25, the MPC is 0.75, and if the MPC is 0.5. So go ahead and hit pause now. And here are the three answers. If the MPC is 0.25, then it's a negative 1/3. If the MPC is 0.75, then it's a negative 3. And if the MPC is 0.5, then the taxing multiplier is negative 1. The last multiplier is what's called the balanced budget multiplier. So Congress might decide to not want to add to the deficit and debt by increasing both government spending and increasing taxes. So the key is that they both are going in the same direction. When we learned about expansionary fiscal policy, for example, we said that government wanted to increase spending and decrease taxes. In this case, they're going to pay for the increase in spending by increasing taxes on individuals. The balanced budget multiplier is always equal to 1. Not sometimes, always. So the example I have is if the government increases taxes by $20 billion and increases spending by $20 billion, so the net gain or loss there really is 0, so we're not adding to the deficit and the debt. Then the aggregate demand curve would increase by 20 billion using the same equation as before. Increase in spending times the multiplier is 1 for balanced budget, so we're going to increase by $20 billion. One last note on real GDP gaps. Sometimes they just leave them as GDP gaps. So the idea of it is that the problem is telling you what to increase real GDP by or needs to be. Sometimes they'll give it to you like this. In the worst recession today, the U.S. Congress needs to boost real GDP by $10. So they give you the GDP gap in that case. Sometimes they'll make it calculate it. So the potential GDP is 1,000, so that's the LRAS, that's where we want to be. And current GDP is $5, so we're going to need to close the recessionary gap of $995 using the multiplier, whichever one they ask you for.